Welcome to The Pictures Get Smaller. My name is Adam O'Conaghy, and I'm the producer of this show. The things you will hear over the next 50 minutes or so represent the views of The Pictures Get Smaller and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio and are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. Good evening and welcome to The Pictures Get Smaller. I'm Adam O'Conaghy, and I promise to refrain from continuing with the world's worst Alfred Hitchcock impersonation. Tonight I'm joined by horror fiends Carter Moulton, Ron Felton, and Remy Magnan. We here at The Pictures Get Smaller love Halloween, so we're predictably chatting about horror movies this evening. Instead of merely hyperventilating about how amazing, say, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Black Christmas are, we're going to delve into areas that may be slightly less familiar to our listeners, and perhaps even frightening in their unsettling otherness. That's to say, we're going to examine silent and foreign horror in this episode. So, we may as well start checking out that strange noise we heard in the dark basement, attic, woods, or elsewhere, with one of the most influential horror films, and just influential films in general, of all time, Robert Vine's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, from 1919 or 1920. So sort of...
Both, maybe? I don't know. I've seen both.
Yeah, I know on the box it says 1919, but I think the official credit is 20.
Yeah, okay. Excellent. Well, I thought this was a good starting point as any. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a film that I begin my introduction to horror class with. It's a classic silent film, a classic of German Expressionism. So that maybe we could chat about why that particular film is such a, important film in horror and in other, just in general. And then we could kind of branch out from there. So I think this is one that we've all seen, right? Like everyone's seen Caligari.
Yes.
Yeah, why does it remain so effective? Why is it such a powerful film, even after 90 plus years?
I think one thing is, and you get this with German Expressionism in general, but this sort of defamiliarization with location, right? So like you have angular sets and very jagged, unrealistic, and this is sort of extended through movement too. Characters move very either mechanically or very expressionistic. Yeah, I don't know. There's long gestures, elongated gestures. So I mean, here you have in this movement a sort of through images and movement and different aesthetics, you have this sort of defamiliarization of the image, which is in itself disorienting and sort of creepy in a way, right? So you add on top of that this madman and this sleepwalking monster, and you get horror.
Yeah, I like that you brought up that word defamiliarization right away. It's like a Russian formalist term, right? And they're writing at the same era as this film was released. I think Victor Shklovsky, is that his name? Was one who advocated that art had to be about the defamiliarization of the world. So perhaps that's a good way to justify our interest in horror, that it actually is doing something with artistic merit, since that's the kind of knock against the genre.
Yeah, and I mean the disorientation that the set produces kind of physically or reflects physically, contextualizes nicely. I think what you were saying, the disorientation that you get kind of intellectually or emotionally, in some ways prepares you for some exploration of madness and dreams, right? And that was one thing I kept seeing come up again and again when I was revisiting some of the early horror films was, and I guess you still see this today, but especially in those, a lot of tension between the body and the mind in terms of, what's scary. There's something that's physically scary, a monster, but then you start exploring these kind of mental realms that are maybe even scarier.
Right.
Because that could happen to us. Like we could become
true.
Crazy.
Yeah. What seems to be the threatening monster in the film is revealed to be like the subjective perspective of this crazy person, right? Although that sort of the bookends to that film were sort of tacked on by the producers, like they wish to actually set up Dr. Caligari as the evil figure when in the way that the film text is,
Spoiler
he's actually
alert.
Yes. Yes, apologies for the 90-year-old spoilers. If you
There's
haven't
gonna be a
seen
few
the
of those
film,
tonight, I think.
there's a fair going on. Dr. Caligari comes there and wants to display his somnambulist, Cesar, and says, Caligari has Cesar commit all these crimes for him, murders, etc. And then it's revealed eventually that Dr. Caligari is the director of a mental institution, and then it's further revealed that the evil Caligari is the fantasy of an inmate at the institution, and that's the sort of bit that was tacked on by the producers of the film, and against the wishes of Robert Vine.
I'm not sure with that. I don't
Yes.
know.
Let's just roll a die and we'll pick one.
Yeah.
No, I mean, Caligari is also one of the earliest horror films. It's certainly not the only one in this era, but it's one of the very early horror films that really sort of begins this ongoing trope of the commodification of the body at the same time, right? So Cesar is literally being put on display as a somnambulist, as an anomaly, and we see this as we move forward on and on with the horror genre throughout history. I mean, clearly with Freaks, right? Ty Browning's Freaks, we see this as well. And it's also, it's for me a very important film because it can be read as potentially the first zombie film in some way.
Definitely.
Right? Although, of course, this is the very beginning, so it's not going to be the iconography that we are presently aware of in terms of zombie films, but it has this...
But it fits in with others within the next 20 years, like say White Zombie or I Walked with a Zombie, where there's figures who are under the spell of someone else instead of being the dead rising from the grave, right?
Right. Well, and it's that the commodification of the body in Caligari really starts something off in zombie films because this is something that happens time and time again. Particularly, I mean, we don't need to get very far into it, but I mean, Romero has very overt social issues happening in his trilogy, right? And it's really all surrounding either commodification or ethnicity in some way, right?
Definitely. Class.
So, absolutely. So Caligari really kind of starts us off, and I think, at least for horror scholars or those that I suppose, it's a problematic term, but informed horror fans have absolutely seen Caligari and hold value for it in that way. But many horror fans at the same time have never seen Caligari, and it tends to be one of the ones that I think slips underneath at times, right?
I mean, for some viewers, there's just a resistance to silent films in general, I suppose.
Of course, sure. It is interesting to me though that we see these remakes over and over again.
Yeah.
And Caligari is one that sort of has slipped through the cracks.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if we look 1910, we have Edison's Frankenstein. It's really, in many ways, the first American horror film, which is already working inside of adaptation.
Yeah, and that's really quite a sophisticated film.
Absolutely.
I want to get to that in a second, actually. If you're listening, you can actually watch the 1910 Edison-produced Frankenstein on YouTube right now. It's about 8 or 10 minutes long. It's really really remarkable, actually. It's really sophisticated for being a short literary adaptation from the silent era. But with Caligari, just to linger on that point a bit, I thought it was interesting the way you brought up horror and commodification of bodies, or horror even in spectacle. And so it seems like with that issue of spectacle and commodification, it's both in terms of the narrative and the marketing of horror, right? Your bodies are commodified within the text, and they're marketed as commodities to come see the grotesque figure in this film, even as those figures are manipulated, perhaps. But yeah, Caligari is certainly a foundational text in horror, and as you pointed out, Remy, that there's at least this origins of the zombie film can be traced back to it, and arguably others. Something along the lines of the possession film. Caligari himself seems to be possessed by the spirit of an ancient mystic, and he has these visions of like the trees becoming words in the film, which is pretty lovely. We get just the iconography of the knife and assaults with knives. We get this female victim, which is a obviously problematic recurring trope across horror. Anything else like from this initial text that seem to linger?
I think maybe this would be a good segue into Nosferatu, but we don't have to talk about that yet. But going back to that point of the way the story's framed, in Nosferatu, you have the story being told through this book, right? It's like the account of the death in Wisborg in 1838 or something like that, right? So it's interesting how these two texts, although you said the producer sort of slipped this in late in the film, but how the act of storytelling is sort of it's a story within a story in a sense,
right.
And how that might add to, I don't know, sort of enriching it with folklore, like urban legend status, or just a rich history of I don't know, some sort of creepiness that comes with archaic stories or old stories. I don't know where to go with that, but I think that's something that just now, even if we view them as texts now, how far back they are, there's something scary. Just the fact I'm imagining, in 100 years, and 2 generations from now, when they're looking back on these films, right, how different they're going to seem,
right.
And how sort of ancient they're going to seem, and how that might add to the horror that they're giving.
Yeah. I mean, if that notion of stories within stories recurs across horror, right? Because the genre deals so much with history, with memory, with pastness, and so that's often like a convention, particularly in zombie films, of survivors telling each other stories of survival, of things they've witnessed, and even though we don't often see that, it's somewhat. We're getting some background music here. It's
funky.
It adds horror. It adds unseen horror, a sense of menace, like throughout the diegetic world of the film. Ron, you were.
Yeah. Well, excuse me. Yeah, this just occurred to me as you were saying that. But too, when you hear a secondhand account of something, I heard this happen to somebody.
Yeah.
Right. You give yourself a lot of freedom. You can present something as supernatural, but as the listener, you kind of have this little wall up. You don't know how much of that is really there and genuine.
You expect exaggeration.
Yeah. You can. I think it's easier to lose yourself kind of in the story. And you talk about cinema too, is something that you want to suspend your disbelief and just experience this and be frightened, or in other genres experience what they have to offer, but. I don't know, just as a viewer, and this isn't like an intellectual thing, but just as a viewer, like I want to get sucked in. I just want to become kind of, in some sense, I guess, an active participant in the story. And so they kind of allow that or make that easier by saying, this is a story. I heard this happen to somebody, and then you just kind of go along for the ride. And I'm not sure that's exactly what they were intending, but I think that's one of the effects.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That pretense of truthfulness or actual happening. Definitely. I mean, that's maybe one thing we can keep circling back to throughout is when we're talking about particular films, like how they kind of go to work on us as viewers. Like I would say horror films, in my mind at least, are the most formally interesting of genres because they're designed to affect you, and overtly so. And so we can talk about all the different techniques they use in different films. And obviously, one of those is maybe less of a formal thing, but more of a narrative thing in the way that characters talk to one another. Carter threw out Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau, another great horror director, and Remy brought up Frankenstein, 1910. Any comments on these? Well, Murnau obviously has multiple films, but Remy.
Well, Carter made me think of this when he was talking about The Tale Within a Tale, right?
Yeah.
And how this begins very early in the horror genre. And particularly during the silent era, that really sort of makes the necessary intertextuality of silence very self-evident in these films in some way, right? Because with a silent film, we have to be visually stimulated. We also have to read at the same time.
Of course, yeah.
Right? So this Tale Within a Tale seems in some way to echo that, right? And then if we're moving on to Nosferatu, we can see that we're still continuing this adaptation, text within a text, right? Because even Dracula novel itself is a collection of their accounts of these stories, right?
And that film is notoriously an unauthorized adaptation of that text.
Right. And And all of the adaptations of Dracula seem to take that up in some way, right?
Yeah. That there are books that all the characters reference to know about the threat, the vampiric threat.
Right. So it was kind of my 2 cents on Murnau, though. For now.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about this film is the use of shadow, and the way that Nosferatu, although he's a very grotesque, body, but how he sort of transcends body, and he starts when he begins to attack, whether it's Hutter, who is the main protagonist of the film, or Ellen, who is. Although if you watch the YouTube version, they changed the names, which I'm teaching this film for my composition class, and some of my students watched it on YouTube and they had the names completely wrong. But so there's a disclaimer, but it is available on YouTube.
Yeah,
but,
it's public domain. There's so many bad versions floating around, and the
yeah.
color tinting's off.
Right.
Like,
Well, there's the version on Netflix now that has a gothic soundtrack that replaces the original one, which is really sort of interesting.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of, I don't know. I would recommend the YouTube one and then get the right names.
Yeah, and there is a Kino released version, which is probably the definitive.
Well, yeah, if you have
access to it,
more desire to do that. But I think so there's something about when the scenes where he's getting ready to suck the blood of his victims, he sort of he's depicted as merely a shadow, and the shadow is able to open doors without touching them, and sort of grasp souls without touching them. So here we have sort of a weird dynamic between the body and outside of the body, or the supernatural, and that's sort of adds a little bit to what I think Caligari was doing. Although shadow is also used in Caligari in interesting
Obviously,
ways.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's that strong of a that stark of a representation of pure evil.
It's the set design in Caligari. It's the lighting scheme in Nosferatu. Yeah, I think that's a great point with horror. The threatening monster oftentimes has this effect outside of its physical body, right? That the environment itself seems to be reshaped simply by the presence of the creature. Even a sort of primitive effect that's used is the negative reversal during like an early scene when Nosferatu first appears on screen. So he's literally like turned dark into light and light into dark for a few seconds on screen, which I think is kind of fascinating. And the later Werner Herzog remake of Nosferatu, which actually is pretty good in its own right, it sort of elaborates on this sense of Nosferatu infecting the environment. There's these sort of dreamy scenes with people eating dinner amongst rats, like crawling all over them. So it's really an evocative film from the 70s, so 80 years on after, 60 years on after the original text came out. With Nosferatu, I mean, obviously that brings up other Murnau films. I think he's most well known for Nosferatu. Others probably for Sunrise, which came up earlier in the Pictures Get Smaller. But he's done a few other horror films as well, including, Faust, yes, and The Haunted Castle, an old like sort of chamber horror piece. And again, even Sunrise has horror elements. And The Last Laugh is this Murnau like German expressionist film that's not quite horror, but there's moments that veer into that territory, at least a little bit. I'm not sure. Does anyone
I think that would be, something that he was able to take that German expressionistic technique and sort of transplant it and take it outside of just horror. We see it in Sunrise too.
Definitely.
But I haven't seen Faust, so.
Faust is really sophisticated. As much as Sunrise, I would say, but it's perhaps, not remarked upon as much because it is like a horror tale.
Right.
Sure. I haven't seen it either, right? But one of the things that's really provocative about Murnau is the way he manipulates expressionism from film to film, right? So if I were to compare Caligari and Nosferatu, at least in the set design, we see the expressionism much more in Caligari than Nosferatu. But Nosferatu is classically considered one of the greatest pieces of horror German expressionism at the same time, right? And it's absolutely the lighting, right, and the character design, the costuming that goes into a lot of that.
And even if the sets aren't exaggerated, because there's an exaggerated figure, this body of Nosferatu inhabiting them, they take on this other sense that just the normal arch of a castle doorway, because it is framed around the curve of Nosferatu's body. It seems as if this space is an extension of himself, right?
The boat as well. You get the sailboat with the large, the sails almost mimic the set design in Caligari in interesting ways. And we're positioned from below, looking up at this huge, vast, ugly rat man. So yeah, I mean, there's ways that he sort of takes, if you want to think of the set design of Expressionism as taking place indoors in these constructed sets, he takes that and sort of, throws it onto nature. And you get that with the scene of, not through Expressionism, but Fear of Nature and the professor scenes, where you have this professor sort of going over like the Venus flytrap and different occurrences in nature that are strange and we can't quite understand. So that seems to be another theme that he's exploring there and we get that in the movement of Nosferatu, Count Orlok, from his castle into this regular town, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of
nature infecting civilization somehow.
Totally, yeah. With the plague too.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe for the sake of time then, we can move on a bit from Nosferatu and Murnau. I wanted to talk about, it's okay with you guys, the sort of what I consider the two iconic stars of silent horror. One I consider to be Conrad Veidt, the other is Lon Chaney, obviously. So Conrad Veidt starred in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as Cesar, the somnambulist who was under the spell of Caligari. He also appeared in The Hands of Orlok, another collaboration with Robert Vine, which is really a remarkable silent film. It's one of my, aside from the two big ones of Caligari and Nosferatu, The Hands of Orlok might be my favorite silent horror film. And then he also appeared in The Man Who Laughs, which is directed by Paul Lenny, who directed a few other silent horror films, and was an early, it's known now perhaps for inspiring the character of the Joker in Batman, because this character in The Man Who Laughs has a ghoulish disfigurement on his face of a gigantic smile cut into his face as a child. The makeup was actually designed by Jack Pierce, who did the makeup for the famous Boris Karloff Frankenstein makeup. So he's this sort of iconic behind-the-scenes figure in horror history, and this is one of his iconic, makeup developments. So Conrad Veidt's the one figure. I don't know if any of you have seen Orlok or The Man Who Laughs, and then we also have Lon Chaney, who is a major figure in cinema, particularly American silent cinema. So yeah, any comments? Any
is
thoughts
The Man
on
Who
this?
Laughs? I haven't seen it. Is it? Apart from that ghoulish smile, would it be considered horror?
Well, it's perhaps not quite. It's one of those that
I didn't
skirts
know.
the boundaries. It feels almost like a historical drama with this poor kid who's been disfigured and sort of has this ghastly look. So it's more of like an outsider film than a pure horror film. But there are a few expressionistic moments, even though it's an American film. And there are obviously the figure of that man himself is grotesque.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I'd actually ask a similar question about a lot of Lon Chaney films. Do they really qualify as horror in the way that we at least now think of horror?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah.
But they certainly are disturbing, and they're unsettling in some ways, and I guess depending on what our parameters are there.
Right.
I don't know. You're the boss, Adam.
No, I'm no boss here. This is a group discussion. But I definitely agree with what you were just saying. I think the little bit of reading I've done historically about Lon Chaney suggests similar things, that when he passed away in 1930, right in the cusp of the sound era, or the transition period, he was known as the man of a thousand faces, right, for doing all his makeup himself. But he wasn't known as a horror actor, even though he'd had horrific roles. And so, yeah, many of his roles were disfigurements, disabilities, but they weren't considered horror because horror didn't really come into being as a category until right after sort of Dracula and Frankenstein were released by Universal. And then in hindsight, Lon Chaney was rebranded as a horror director, and they partially did that when his son, Lon Chaney Jr., well, that was his stage name, began his career, and they tried to attach the son to the father by making them both icons of horror in hindsight, right? Yeah.
No, I think the Phantom of the Opera. Have you the 1925 version? That is one of my favorites. I don't know. I think there's something about the way, not even the character of the Phantom. The makeup is incredible, first of all, but the first half of that film, the way it sort of creates this brooding atmosphere and this like dark through trap doors and people moving in and out of spaces. A bunch of because it takes place, if you've seen the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. It takes place at this opera house, and throughout the first half of the movie, there's this really good cultivation of this sense of foreboding and that something's lurking beneath you.
Yeah.
And I haven't actually seen anything else that Lon Chaney's in, so I don't know. But for me, I would.
With your description, I like that idea of it creates this sense of something off screen, something unseen.
Yeah,
but
totally.
it's a presence looming, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Adam, I think you brought up the idea of disfigurement in Lon Chaney films.
Yes.
In one film, he's missing arms, and The Penalty, he's missing a leg.
2 legs.
Two
yeah.
legs. Yeah,
Or-
right. Both.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
But either way, it's something that I don't know. I mean, and there are a lot of shadows in those films too, and there also the settings are kind of there's something a little creepy about them, whether it's kind of like a carnival or
The underworld.
The underworld, yeah, exactly. What was that one movie?
The Penalty is when he's the mob boss.
Yeah, and then there's also the one, I think it's something Aces. Do you know this?
Oh, there's Laugh Clown Laugh, Ace of Hearts.
Yeah, something like that,
Yeah.
where there's also this, there's this murder that has to be committed, and they basically draw cards to see who has to do it.
Yeah.
So there are all these kind of underworld, seedy elements that at least take you into a realm that, most people probably aren't
Yeah.
used to or comfortable with, and in that way, it's kind of horrifying.
It's strange that thinking of the fact that now we project like horror onto Lon Chaney, but he's in these films that are to some degree crime films, or even almost melodramas, just with grotesque figures, and horror, particularly like German expressionist horror, then came to influence crime films, right, through film noir later. So there's a weird overlapping of genres here, which Remy, you talked about earlier, and perhaps we can come back to this when we get into foreign horror a bit more.
Sure.
But yeah, these categories aren't quite pure, right? They're always kind of contaminated with one another. Go ahead, Ron.
Oh, I was just thinking, I'm trying to define for myself what is horror, what's not horror, and I was thinking, well, one element that always seems to be present or is often present in what I think most people consider to be horror films is some kind of supernatural element. But then, and I think we were discussing this by email, maybe one of the films we'd discuss would be Cat and the Canary,
Right,
which
yeah.
is like, a classic kind of haunted house thriller. But even then, it's revealed that none of the things, I guess, spoiler alert, but, none of the things that you see going on that you're led to believe are supernatural end up being supernatural.
Yeah.
Yeah, it still qualifies.
Of course, yeah. The Cat and the Canary is a Wallace Horsley film. He also did The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Lon Chaney as Quasimodo. And yeah, and he did The Penalty with no wait, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up here. Paul Lenny did The Cat and the Canary. He also directed Man Who Laughs and Waxworks.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Horsley did The Penalty and Hunchback of Notre Dame. But yeah, The Cat and the Canary is typical. Like it's a, it's a haunted house caper where it's revealed that there aren't ghosts. And that's another element of horror that was common to American horror, at least. Maybe not American silent horror, maybe not foreign silent horror, but American silent horror, that there weren't actual supernatural threats. Things that seem that way were revealed not to be supernatural. Sort of famous Lon Chaney film that has since been lost is London After Midnight. There's like stills of him in this crazy vampire makeup going around. But apparently in the film it's revealed that he is like an undercover detective pretending to be a vampire or something like that. But for whatever reason, till essentially Dracula, Todd Browning's Dracula, American horror did not feature supernatural in general. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it's really Lon Chaney's death that in some way marks exactly how we're going to understand, and digest his entire body of work, right? Originally, Carl Laemmle Sr., who was in charge of Universal Studios
Right.
at the time, his son, Carl Laemmle Jr., wanted to produce Dracula.
That's right.
And was only given the okay if Lon Chaney would star as the Count in
Yeah.
the film, right? And it's only once he dies in 1930 that they had to go with this unknown, quote unquote, who was really only known in America for the Broadway productions that he was doing as Dracula at the time, Bela Lugosi.
Right.
And in some ways, it's Chaney's death that really gives Lugosi a life in film.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
some way, right? But it also, if Chaney were to have played Dracula, then we would be missing this very interesting maneuver in which we can see his films as not quite horrific.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Ron, you brought up how do we really define horror, and that's, to me, that's kind of a question I've been wrestling with for a while, right? Because I mean, on the one extreme, we have exactly what is marketed as horror,
Sure.
and what is commercially successful and viable, right? On the other extreme, you can really, in some sense, take any film as horrific, depending on our notion of spectatorship of the horror film. All right, so if we're looking at an individual spectator, that individual spectator happens to be agoraphobic, then Western films could be highly horrific to them in some way. All right, so that's when I speak of horror, right? When I write on horror, I'm really thinking about what is, I suppose, quote unquote, commercially viable.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And what we take to be sort of the classic iconography of
Yeah.
these films. But yeah, I mean, it is absolutely very interesting that it's Chaney's death that really gives us this sort of interesting binary to the body of work that he does. Whereas, is it
Yeah.
horror? Is it not horror?
It requires a revisionist history to make him a horror figure.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, it's in some ways it is his special effects makeup
Yeah.
work that really, I think, marks him as being this icon in horror. Right?
Yeah.
Because even if the narratives themselves aren't necessarily standard horror fare, this makeup is so horrific in some way just in and of itself.
It's
that
true.
It throws him into that.
And even just the sort of legend around Chaney about the physical, discomfort he would go to for his films. So like the Penalty, in which he has a double amputee beneath the legs. He invented these devices to bind up his legs, and he shot the film that way. It was incredibly, or it was reportedly excruciating, for him to do, but he
No computers. Huh?
nonetheless he did it. Yes,
Yeah,
yeah. The same with The Unknown, in which he's binds his arms so that he can't, so he looks like he has no arms because he's a criminal on the run. But he achieves these effects through sort of giving up his own body for the craft, which adds to the Chaney legend. And that's why I do think it's curious that a figure like Jack Pierce is a major figure in horror. And we've had sort of throughout horror history at certain times a few standout effects guys, right? This is a genre that maybe lends fans to investigate who's behind the scenes more than others, perhaps. So Jack Pierce comes along at the time right when Lon Chaney passes away and is no longer sort of working. And perhaps, if Chaney was around, Pierce wouldn't have had the opportunity to create the makeup for Frankenstein's monster and Boris Karloff, because it seems like a role perfect for Lon Chaney, perhaps. Well, we're getting, midway through the show here. Before moving on to foreign horror in general, I just want to wrap up Silent by throwing this out to all of you. And if horror then is some sort of fear of the past or history, or history becoming monstrous and threatening, something repressed that returns, can we think of silent horror as a whole as some sort of uncanny category, sort of a filmic mode that retains otherness or sense of pastness? And Carter, I think you began to speak to this a while ago, that imagining future generations, but I also feel that way when I'm watching silent horror. It's doing something different to me than any other form of horror, that's for sure. So are there any things we can say about silent horror as a whole instead of these individual films and directors?
I think it's a different approach. I mean, I don't know how you guys feel about the jump aesthetic, right? Or the sudden burst of music.
Oh yeah.
And when we were talking about stuff that seems supernatural but doesn't turn out to be so, I thought of the fake jump, right? Where you just get a loud crash, but it's just pots and pans in the
Sure.
kitchen or something like that. But silent horror, I mean, you do have sort of these moments. You get the unmasking of Lon Chaney in the Phantom of the Opera and things like that. But there's an emphasis on just this grotesque image that doesn't necessarily surprise us.
Right.
It's
just
there
on screen
Right.
for a long time.
Right, and we just look at it in shadow, and so it's a very different approach to what's frightening.
Yeah.
And one other thing that I just want to say before we wrap up silent horror is this idea of overlapping genres and not being able to really decide what is considered horror is really interesting when you put it
Sure.
into the context of the Méliès films and the
Oh, right.
in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Haunted Castle was, it's largely considered to be the first horror film. But if you look at it, I mean, it's a funny film. It's got skeletons and bats appearing and witches brewing cauldrons, and the ending is quite funny. So I don't know. I think, and you're seeing that again in horror, and you've always seen this in horror, is this dark humor and this campiness.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to mention that.
And even A Trip to the Moon, it's often cited as the first fantasy film or the first science fiction film. All of those films, those genres, I should say, inform horror to some degree, right? Or horror informs them to some degree. So yeah, we definitely see Méliès as a perhaps pivotal figure, not only in film history, but horror.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, you reminded me of The Cat and the Canary again, which I would actually present to people as more of a comedy than a horror film.
It kind of is, a bit.
It's hilarious.
Yeah.
That main male protagonist, it's totally slapstick. He's always falling down in a way that's supposed to be funny. Like we're never really supposed to, I don't think, fear for him or empathize with his fear. Like he's presented as a ridiculous character.
Right.
So I don't know, that's interesting to me anyway.
Yeah, there's something about being terrified and laughing that somehow goes hand in hand.
Or even in some more contemporary films, like a slasher flick or something, there's always, that one annoying character that you want to die. You want that kid to get killed first and be out of the way.
Yeah.
We do get a lot of rapid tonal shifts in horror.
Yeah. One more thing about
Sure,
silent
yeah,
films,
definitely.
completely unrelated to everything we've been talking about. But if you are having a Halloween movie marathon right now, I would suggest, and you're with friends, a really fun thing to do is just put on a silent film and do a sort of mystery science theater, adding dialogue. This to Nosferatu is a lot of fun.
It certainly is, yeah. The character of Hutter is like one of the great comic characters in my mind.
Totally.
In Nosferatu, he's just a goofy, happy-go-lucky guy who keeps shaking off like all the horror around him and sort of laughing about it.
Yeah.
Like he finds vampire marks on his neck and he's like,
He's like, hurry up, I got to go to the land of ghosts and thieves. I'm ready. Everyone's just like, what are you doing?
Yeah, he's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I guess the only other thing that I was thinking about silent horror kind of generally, and this occurred to me as I was, rewatching some films in the last few days preparing for today, was I guess like the tensions presented or represented between religion and science. And science is something that we should be fearful of or skeptical of or at least very careful with.
Mm-hmm.
I think I heard you mentioning Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde earlier. I mean, that's probably, to me anyway, the best representation of what I'm talking about. You have Dr. Jekyll, who is described as a progressive scientist. He's experimental. And in that way, his colleagues are kind of, I don't know, not totally supportive of him, but they all agree he's really like this perfect man. He doesn't succumb to any of his vices or anything. And then anyway, throughout the film,
the morally upright progressive scientist.
Yeah, right. And then, some of his colleagues are saying this is a dangerous kind of lifestyle choice you've made because you're totally repressed. And they try to get him to indulge. They take him to this, essentially, I guess, what is a brothel, with the showgirl, and he gets tempted, and then that informs the science, and he decides, well, wouldn't it be great if I could split these two parts of myself, right? So I had one that could indulge in all all the vices, and this other one that could remain kind of morally upstanding.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's the catalyst really for all the terrifying things that end up happening.
And it creates another sort of horror convention that the deviant persona is always the ugly, grotesque, monstrous one, right? Which is like in Bram Stoker's Dracula, like the Count is this sort of suave, sexy guy. And obviously Nosferatu is definitely not the case. He's this rodent-like creature. And even in the Todd Browning adaptation, we still have a figure of otherness, a foreign character who's the lead. He's suave, right? You can't deny that Bela Lugosi isn't, but at the same time, he's still marked as a part. And I think it'd be almost more interesting if in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that the Jekyll grotesque figure was the upright one, and the the quote unquote clean sort of cut guy is the deviant.
Yeah, but it's just interesting to think about a lot of those early horror films coming about in a time in history where you know, science wasn't thought of the way it's thought of now, and so it was something like, are you playing God, and what are the risks of doing that? And so that's always presented, or usually presented in these films, you know, in a kind of moral way. Like, okay, so this is going to lead to experimentation and temptation, and that's going to lead to sin, and then shame, and, you know, what happens with all of that. And I don't know. That was the only other thing I was really thinking of about silent films or silent horror films.
Yeah, and I mean that those tensions between science and religion just they pervade the genre. They come up again and again, particularly maybe more recently in like possession films, and I guess, you know, oftentimes people argue that the horror genre is a conservative genre because people who do bad things, quote bad things, are killed in certain subgenres of horror, like the slasher subgenre or something. Possession films often reaffirm like the authority of religious institutions, that they have this ability to overcome just inherent evil in the world somehow. So yeah, it certainly is something that begins in these early films, as you're pointing out, and remains in tension for the last 90 years. Were there any other than silent films or things that we want to bring up? Another figure obviously is Todd Browning, who bridges that gap in ways that maybe not too many other figures do. He begins making silent films with Lon Chaney. Not necessarily horror films, but again, like films with grotesque figures. And then he obviously continues on with Freaks, as Remy brought up, and Dracula too. Those are American, which are off the topic, off the list tonight. One transitional film, which it seems major to me, is Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire. And so he's most well known perhaps for The Passion of Joan of Arc, the great silent film, which also has horror elements. When Joan of Arc is killed and burned at the stake, it's really horrifying. You see like everything kind of, which was shocking to me the first time I saw that film. Vampire was released in the early 30s, I believe, and it's a film that I remember as being silent, even though it's not. It does have dialogue, but it just so like bound in images, and in this subjective experience where you're just sort of watching things and you're just brought into this world of mystery. There's a dream sequence where someone is gazing out from his own casket, which is really remarkable. Anyway, it's a great transitional film, I would say, between silent and horror, even if or silent and sound horror, even if it feels more silent to me. Any other any films that we can think of to sort of bring us into foreign horror? Should we just dive right in with some random choices?
Well, I mean, I can. You're seeing also Browning in some ways as transitional figure, which a lot of people do, but at the same time, he was very, very hesitant and unsure of himself in sound.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And because of that, we see another huge convention start really right at the birth of sort of the meeting of sound and horror, which is sound as a tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? It's not something that needs to be immediately proliferated into every single corner of the films that we're making, right? We need to actually use it in some way that's amplifying the effect that we're trying to get across.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So even in Dracula, we see these very, very long sort of empty spaces.
There's almost no soundtrack except for diegetic sounds.
Right. Well, and that's actually why they tried to replace it with the Glass soundtrack later, right?
Yeah. Although there is that eerie opening credit sequence with Swan Lake playing, which feels really, unsettling.
Right. Well, they replaced that as well with the Glass soundtrack,
Yeah.
And it just sort of shows you how they were attempting to re-commercialize it based on these transitions that we see occurring in horror throughout history.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I don't think it's something that they'll try again.
Probably not. Yeah, it seems on par with colorization, I think.
Right. Unfortunately, I can't speak much to Vampire. I haven't seen it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, honestly, we have such little time left. I feel like we're going to have just a whole other show to get into this topic of foreign horror, but we can at least begin here. So many different options. I mean, foreign horror is a gigantic category. Since you're here, you sort of do some research on Irish and South African horror, which admittedly are categories that are entirely unfamiliar to me.
Sure.
So I'm wondering what sorts of developments do you see in those national cinemas in the horror genre? Is there anything that seems to be consistent across some of the films you've encountered? Any anxieties? Since with horror, so much of it, at least for me, is dealing with the films in relation to historical context and cultural context. And I feel like that's a challenge of studying foreign horror. If you aren't familiar with those, you are missing maybe an element of what's horrific about the film, what it's referring to, what it's, standing in as a metaphor for, whatever.
Sure.
So in Irish and South African horror.
Yeah, I mean, really what brought me to the table with these two nations in particular, and this is happening in other nations at the same time, but the emergence of horror as a genre in their own film industries came very, very late. So in Ireland, the first self-contained Irish-produced horror film isn't released until 2005.
Okay.
Right, and coming to that realization immediately, when I first came to it, I had no idea, right, what this was going to sort of reveal to me, and it's still something that I learn more about every day. But
considering the traumatic history of Ireland over the past 100 years or
Right.
so, you'd think they would be especially prone to making horror
Well,
films.
but in some way, that can also be read as the reason why they don't need to.
Yeah.
Right. Because in some way, just a docudrama or a biopic of what's happening at the time in the country is going to be horrific, right? And they can just look out the window and get all the horror that they can stomach.
Though Stoker was Irishman, correct? Right?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
we have this history and other legends, like the Banshee is Irish,
Right.
or is,
Well, which is really interesting at the same time too, because to this day, right, from 2005 till 2012, they actually haven't produced any of their own adaptations of their classic Gothic literature.
yeah, that's fascinating.
Right. So they've turned more to sort of, I suppose, what we might consider more contemporary, commercially viable forms of horror, right? So sort of the American tropes that we've taken on, they use them, but they use them in specific ways, right? So 2005, Dead Meat is released, directed by Conor McMahon, and it's kind of a very classic zombie send-up, right? But whereas in a film like 28 Days Later, where the horror begins really with monkeys, in Dead Meat, it's cattle. It's cows, right?
Okay.
Which is really interesting, right? It's not something that pervades through the entire narrative, but it's the zombie infection is launched by a cow.
Mad cow disease, essentially.
Right. Well, and what's interesting is the next one that comes out the next year, Isolation, O'Brien in 2006, is about a cow rung amok at the same time too, right? So they're very much kind of reflecting on this issue of kind of food and mad cow disease, and right, which is something that isn't really confined just to their nation.
No.
Right, which is also interesting because this reflection can be seen as helping them transition horror into their own country at the same time. In South Africa, their first horror film is 1992, Dust Devil, directed by Richard Stanley, which also deals with food in some way, but here it's water.
Okay.
Right? So the landscapes are very, very dry, right? You only get maybe 3 scenes where you even see water at all, right? And it's also taking place sort of at the very end of apartheid. So it's in some way reflecting on that. And around this same time of production, we have these struggles between the tribes who are beginning to take over the nation and who is going to be controlling the water and whether or not it's going to be commercialized. So you're absolutely right. In terms of international horror, it really seems as if they're using what they're finding horrific or whatever is building anxiety in themselves as a people, they're using that in horror to sort of get that out to everyone
But only
else.
in the last 10, 20 years.
Well, with these specific
with these
countries.
nationalities, yeah.
Right. I mean, France, Germany, these Britain, they've had horror well before then, right? But particularly with an English-speaking country, it's really quite shocking to me personally to find that Ireland only creates their first horror film in 2005.
Yeah, that is peculiar.
So.
And even with South African films, something like District 9 is doing a similar sort of, take on apartheid, but filtered through sci-fi conventions instead of horror in particular. Yeah, interesting.
So I'm not sure if I should stick with Ireland and continue going kind of through their history, or if you guys have particular.
I'm not well versed in foreign horror.
Yeah.
Well, we could go into this too, which is kind of subgenre blends, which is something that's really becoming quite popular in international film too. And we were talking about REC.
Right. Spanish horror recently has had this. There's been a lot of Spanish horror over the last 10 years.
Right.
Almost all of which the main ones have been remade as American films. There's the REC series, which is a found footage horror series remade as Quarantine in America. There is Them, which was remade as The Strangers. Them is kind of crazy mess. The Strangers, I think, is one of the best sort of modestly scaled horror films in recent years in America. And then The Silent House, which is a sort of formal gimmick. It's a single long take, and it was remade with the same title in America. I actually haven't seen other versions, although the American version has that one Olsen sister who is respectable. She was in Martha, Marcy, Marlene, May, whatever that.
Elizabeth Olsen?
Elizabeth Olsen, yes.
Yeah.
I believe she was in the American version of The Silent House. But anyway, so those are some key Spanish horror films. And yeah, as Rami was suggesting, they blend genres, particularly REC. It's found footage and possession and zombie film all in one. There might be other things in there.
Well, I mean, it's masquerading itself as a zombie film.
Yeah,
Right? It's actually not at all this kind of the spin, the twist at the end.
Right.
Not Shyamalan-esque spin at all. A good one. But what's really interesting about you brought up that this film was remade almost immediately. I mean, REC and Quarantine were almost made kind of on top of each other. And then we see that both of them in their own right are commercially successful. Right? So they spawn sequels, which is not surprising, particularly in horror. But with REC 2 in Spain, this picks up right where the first story leaves off. Right? In America, we have a completely separate group of people who go straight to DVD. It's in an airport or whatever. Right? So that's sort of the dividing line. Right, between what's happening, and they go into like REC 2 sort of expands on this possession,
The mythology,
idea, right. So and kind of further exploring what they were using as a twist in regards to religion of the first film.
Sure.
So
Yeah. I hate to cut you off because I think we could explore that topic a lot more, but we are about out of time. Before we go, I really just kind of been throwing this upon you, but maybe one film you might recommend based on related to our topics tonight, silent horror or foreign horror. I know there's one we didn't get to, Carter. I don't know if
Eyes
you want to
Without
bring
a
that one up.
Face
Yes.
is a wonderful French film, 60s, I believe. And I don't want to, give anything away, but Eyes Without a Face is definitely a great one.
Surgical horror, and it's
Yeah.
surprisingly graphic,
Yeah.
but also more than just spectacle.
It actually has a similar approach to horror that we talked about in Silent, is where we don't get a lot of jumpy moments, but we're just sort of looking at this strange image for a long period of time.
Well, when we do our show on foreign horror, we'll have to get into Eyes Without a Face a lot more.
Sure.
Yeah, Remy or Ron?
Well, I mean, I'll go Carter's route and bring up one we didn't have time to talk about, which would be High Tension.
Oh, right.
Alexandre Aja, 2003. If you're very into the slasher genre, it is a slasher film, but it's taking the iconography that we conventionally see in that subgenre and turning it completely on its head. All that iconography is still very readily present, right? But its functionality in a particular film is markedly different than it is another one. So I would absolutely have to suggest that film.
And some crazy stuff with gender and sexuality in that film as well.
Absolutely.
And I will have to mention something from the great nation of Japan, since that somehow didn't come up today in our discussion. But House.
Yes.
Which was it Obayashi who did that?
Obayashi?
Yeah. I think so.
Obayashi.
Yeah. So I'm going to go with that. 77 you have down there.
I do, yeah.
Is the year.
Yeah, and that's available through the Criterion Collection, actually.
It is, yeah.
It's another off-the-wall, really fun haunted house film that is frightening, but also just so goofy and ridiculous that you don't know what to make of it. Yeah, Remy, you were going to chime in there. Sorry.
Oh no, you brought up the Criterion Collection, and it reminds me that in terms of horror, there's a much greater focus on foreign horror.
Yeah.
The Criterion Collection.
Right. Vampire, for instance, from Dreyer is available through there.
Right.
So is Eyes Without a Face.
Yep.
Well, and Rosemary's Baby just became available as part of the Criterion Collection. It just seems to me like they're missing so much.
His Repulsion already was by Polanski, which is a great sort of psychological horror film.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as for me, my recommendation, I would go back to The Hands of Orlok, the other collaboration between director Robert Vine and star Conrad Veidt. Great silent horror film. It has a kind of tacky twist at the end, but it's very atmospheric and very much in the German expressionistic vein. So yeah, happy Halloween, everyone. Later tonight, there's a performance of Night of the Living Dead with puppets at the Oriental Theater, if you're so inclined. At the Union Theater, there's also a screening of Tucker and Dale versus Evil. It's going to start in about 2 minutes. Fun film for recent years, and a showing of The Shining at 9 o'clock, which I think I might actually be attending.
Nice.
Tucker and Dale, I believe, is a print. The Shining, I don't think it is. But anyway, thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you again next week on The Pictures Get Smaller. We'll be talking about issues of spectatorship.